dislocating the Arab future from the grip of the political bankruptcy and moral morass in the Arab world might appear remote and relegated to the domain of quixotic dreams. But does it need to be that way? As communities are unsettled, resistances triggered, a chorus of voices fired up, waves of bodies set in motion for justice, and a range of emotions roused even when they no longer have an appetite. Can the continued onslaught on reality not also reinvigorate political thought? Hello everyone, and as my people the Arabs say, may you live long and prosper, I think. Anyway, this is the Fire These Times, and I'm your host, Joey. Each week I bring on a guest, or two, or three, or four, to talk about everything from solar punk to anti-authoritarian politics, passing by intersectional feminism, decolonialism, degrowth and post-growth, global solidarity, and of course the climate emergency. And if any of that sounded too nerdy, you've made it this far, so might as well give the rest of this episode a listen. Finally, this episode was first made available to Patreon supporters, who also get access to all episodes in exchange for helping turn this project into a full-time job. So, if you wanna show my grandmother that this isn't, quote, just a hobby, unquote, please head out to patreon.com/firethesetimes and join the amazing community of folks who are making this project possible. So, anyway, join a union. So the conversation on this podcast is with Amro Ali. He is the author of the words that I started this episode with. They are part of this essay that he's written about 3 years ago now, called On the Need to Shape the Arab Exile Body in Berlin. We talked about what does it look like to move from the centers to the peripheries in the context of the Arab Spring. You might think this is a conversation about Arabs and about Arabs only, but it really isn't. Feel free to check out the description below to look at the different topics that we got into in this episode. And as always, I thank you for listening.
Hello, I'm Amro Ali. I'm based between Egypt and Germany, and I'm a lecturer in sociology at the American University in Cairo, and I'm a postdoc fellow at the Free University in Berlin. And I research on matters related to exile, the Mediterranean world, the Arab world, and political philosophy.
We'll be primarily talking about an essay that you wrote in 2019, I think. And so the title of the essay is On the Need to Shape the Arab Body, the Arab Exile Body in Berlin. So let's just start from the start, as I always do. So what is the essay about? Like, why is there this need, and why Berlin?
I guess you could say it came out of a crisis that I was experiencing around me. Because if you asked me in 2011, during that glorious year that we had in the Arab world, which is important, the center or the periphery, and I would always say the center, that it's important to be in Beirut, to be in Cairo, to be in Damascus, to enact change. Then, of course, things changed over the years for the worse, and I started to reconsider, how things can happen, and maybe that redemption can be in the periphery, that some sort of constructive political change can come from those who are abroad, and how it has happened historically. So the question is, why this need? Why should we bother? But my answer would be that things don't necessarily happen organically. That the idea of to be political and politics requires concerted action, requires a will, requires visions, and a political imagination that translates into some sort of concrete reality. And this requires uh, some sort of discussion and consensus and capacity building. This is not safe to do in the Arab world anymore, and we should be under no illusion that that will happen. But I think also is that we have entered a stage of nihilism in the region where many things just do not make sense anymore. Remember, we're dealing with a region that murdered a journalist in Istanbul in a consulate. We're dealing with a region where people who call themselves leftists yet support the Assad regime. So you're talking about things that have become scrambled and do not make any sense, and therefore there needs to be a reinvigoration of some sort of political imagination that can tie us together in a new chapter, even if it's far away, but with links back home to enact change, even if we don't see it in our lifetime.
And so why Berlin? Why did you pick Berlin?
When I got a fellowship in 2015 to Berlin, and it was only for a few months, and I was amazed at the activities that were happening. Remember, this was also during the height of the refugee wave that was coming from Syria and elsewhere, but mostly Syria. And also, there was a lot of uh, activities happening that I had not seen in other cities. Now, for sure, London, Paris, New York has all these cultural production and dynamics that happen, but there's a difference. These are well established, and it's kind of business as usual in these cities. But where Berlin, it was new and original and fresh, uh, and it was becoming some sort of gravity center, and you felt it. And Berlin made a lot of sense. It was cheaper than the other capitals. It had institutional support uh, than wide-ranging institutional and grassroots support compared to other Western capitals, or even Istanbul if we include Arab exile capitals. And also, it's structured historically and contemporary in a way to favor the liberal arts and the humanities and social sciences for those who want to pursue that, whether in an academic sense or intellectual and creative sense.
Yeah, you in the beginning of your essay you quote Siegfried Kracauer, and so I'm just gonna read the quote because I kind of like it about Berlin. These streets lose themselves in infinity. A countless human crowd moves in them, constantly new people with unknown aims that intersect like the linear maze of a pattern sheet. So there is very much this sense from reading this essay, and Berlin is a city that always fascinated me. I've only been there a couple of times, so I wouldn't say I know it that well, but it's definitely on my to-do list in the sense of like visiting more, getting to know it more, definitely reading about it more as well. But so this sense of Berlin sort of being a place where a lot of different worlds meet, a place where the present has this different dimension to it, we might say, than some of these other cities, obviously partly or largely due to its dark history, and where there is this sense that one can at least in theory, if not in practice, rebuild oneself. As you said, it's not that it's impossible to do so in London or in Paris or in New York, but speaking as someone who knows London and Paris quite well, there are limitations, usually financial, but not just. You also, like for example, when it comes to Paris, you mentioned this in your essay, Paris has this francophonie aspect to it, so like a special, like not a special, but a different type of Arab in many ways that can go there. That's not necessarily accessible to all Arabs that Berlin doesn't have. You already spoke about it, but let's get into it a bit more. What do you think differentiates Berlin from these three cities? And at the same time, you showed me earlier today one of the reactions to your essay. It was published 3 years ago now, more or less. Talk to us a bit about these reactions since you've published it. Why do you think it's gotten this reaction?
I would say that my essay already articulated something that was already there, that was already happening. So it wasn't necessarily something that one just comes on the scene and makes it up. It was already brewing. And I was searching for a language to try to describe it. So it involved a lot of readings. The problem with this phenomenon that was happening in Berlin was that I couldn't find a precedent of it. Of course, there have been exile precedents, but we're talking a very different type of Arab exile phenomenon that has not happened historically uh, with these dynamics, because the every immigration and waves of exiles and diasporas have happened on a country by country basis, um, era by era basis, such as the Libyans fleeing 1970s Gaddafi's Libya, or Lebanese fleeing the 1980s civil war. But there wasn't like it doesn't necessarily happen simultaneously. And when it does, say to the Gulf, it's for economic reasons, and you have to avoid politics to be able to legally stay. So Berlin gave this new sort of uh, platform and era where many can come and bring their creative juices and thoughts and knowledge production to the city. So the reactions have varied. What was surprising about the first primary reaction, I would say first major reaction, was that I didn't speak in Berlin after the essay was published. It was Madrid. And so when I came to Madrid, it was in March 2019, and it was for a cultural salon to discuss the essay. What was interesting was I met all these, not just Arab exiles, but also those who are connected to the Arab exiles, whether they be uh, leftists and socialists and journalists, intellectuals, a few politicians. And so it was really fascinating to see this part of Spain that I really didn't know much about. And so it was a fascinating conversation about how they view Berlin, how they engage with it, how they understood the essay. And I was impressed. I was really impressed because uh, what was interesting about those in Madrid and Barcelona is that they went to Berlin for specific events, and they came back to Spain with this image of Berlin being like this huge dynamic happening, and they forget the other side of Berlin where people have to pay their rent, they face racism, there's all these other things. But I think it was actually a good thing that they came with this picture that inspired them at least to do their own activities. And so that was one reaction. So it was actually two lectures that I gave in Madrid based on that. So I started to engage with Spain and understand it differently than the Spain that I thought I knew before. But the essay changed dynamics in my relationship and the audiences in Spain. And the same applies to Amsterdam and Brussels, Oslo, and then miscellaneous other places. But interestingly enough, you don't get much traction from Paris, New York, or London. And I think that's quite telling. Uh, I didn't get much reactions from these cities, and it could just. I think that the demographics of Europe is showing that there are younger audiences, mobile, fluid, dynamic, uh, in these spaces in Berlin, in Madrid, Barcelona, Amsterdam, and Brussels, and Oslo. So the fact that they're not even traditional capitals of exile, no one thinks of them as such. And so, well, yes, I mean, I did get comments and all that from these cities, but nothing that could consider concerted uh, action where the essay shows up in a workshop or some sort of mobilization, as has happened in other cities. So I think that really speaks volumes, and it confirms uh, things that I had at the back of my mind about the importance of these emergent cities, with Berlin being at the helm, I would say.
There are some potential parallels with London, but not necessarily with the Arab community, but with Hong Kongers, just because of the specific visa arrangement, I guess I would call it. I don't know how to call it. That happened past few years in
These are
response to
parts.
the ongoing visa politics in response to the ongoing crackdowns in Hong Kong. So I know that a lot of friends, because I've been involved with that scene a bit, a lot of friends are now in London when before I was talking to them and they were in Hong Kong, and so that would be an interesting parallel there. But definitely, yeah, I do see what you mean. Even though, as I said, my knowledge of Berlin is still a bit limited. But I can say this, like, as someone who's in Geneva, um, Switzerland has this very weird, as I think many people know, very weird kind of politics. At the same time, it's supposedly neutral. So in theory, anyone can come. In theory, different kinds of exiles, and indeed there have been different kinds of exiles in Switzerland, from like far right to far left and everything in between. Um, but staying in Switzerland is always the question. Staying in Switzerland is always the thing that's usually difficult, because it is it is quite impossible to do unless you have good connections and or basically money. And so even though Geneva has this sizable, I would say sizable Arab community, it's at least in my neighborhood or the area I live in, it's pretty common for me to find Arab shops and to hear Arabic on the streets alongside Spanish, Portuguese, and Italian. Those are the main language that I hear, and other languages as well. Um, yeah, but yeah, there is this sense that, okay, Geneva is very multicultural, multi-ethnic, and a sizable percentage of the population is not from here. I think like 40% or something. But it's difficult to have what you might say like an equivalent to a Berliner or a new Berliner, a Neu Berliner identity or even movement in a city like Geneva. And as far as I can tell, I'm not going to speak for the entirety of Switzerland, but as far as I can tell, the only other real comparison would be with Zurich, and even then as well, I've heard about similar dynamics. Also very diverse, very multi-ethnic, but not necessarily permanent in that sense. And yet the irony is that those are cities, if we speak about Geneva, for example, or Paris or London, those are cities that in many ways feel older than Berlin, because Berlin was obviously very much destroyed in the Second World War. And so there is this very interesting thing happening where Berlin is at the same time new, and at the same time is able to maybe because it's new, or despite the fact that it's new, I'm not too sure, like feel free to kind of add on that, it's able to withhold more, the word that came to my mind is contradiction, I'm not entirely sure why, but more difficulties, more, it's able to absorb more differences, let's say, than I think a city like London or Paris are able to these days. I don't know what you think about that.
You're correct, actually. Like I was mentioning in the essay, the problem, if you want to call it a problem, is that London and Paris are perfect, and I say that in quotes, in some respects, where Berlin is more of an incomplete city. And it's incomplete because of the destruction it's gone through, its identity crisis. It was at the epicenter of the Cold War. It has gone through very dark times and very good times. The You can't have all that happen and not turn out to be a city that's, how could you say, like it's that's 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 not at ease with itself. The difference with Germany and Germany has a lot to account for. I don't want to make it sound like what I'm about to say is that it's only a good thing, but Germany has had a conversation about its past, and it does it better than many other Western countries. It still has a long way to go, for sure. We can agree to that, but it still has that issues where it attempts to reconcile with its past, even if it produces a neurosis and you know uh, you know mis- mislabeling and targeting of Palestinians and so forth. But still, that conversation happens where in in France and the UK, it's still a struggle to get them to recognize their colonial pasts and the crimes they did. Where Germany seems to be at a slight more mature level in this aspect. Uh, and also, it's a post-war phenomenon where West Germany has attempted to rebrand itself and export its soft power, where if it had to avoid military as a way of brandishing itself, it would have to focus on culture and push uh, its face through the Goethe Institute around the world and offer scholarships, which is nothing new, by the way, today. I mean, Germany gives out more scholarships, I think, relative to many other countries in Europe. But this has been happening for a while, and it was something that happened between the East Germany, the GDR, and West Germany as a way to gain international legitimacy. This part has not changed, I would say, much. It's something that it still does a lot.
And specifically when it comes to Arabs, you do talk quite a bit about that, like how due to a specific history, due to a specific configuration of history, I would say, uh, the Germans, and here I'm putting it in quotation, broadly speaking, are not viewed in the same way by many Arabs as the Brits or the French or the Americans, for that matter, obviously. That's not to say, obviously, that they haven't committed crimes, which would be quite ironic to say. Obviously, they have, but then
Namibia.
there is something very specific about, yeah, as you said, like, well, it doesn't have this colonial past in the same way, although it does, but not towards the Arabs.
Yeah.
What do you think that sort of says, like, how? Because I read this and I did kind of, I got the impression, at least in the back of my mind, that yes, this is true, but is this a good thing? Not that you were saying that this is a good thing,
Yeah, yeah.
but what is it about that configuration? For those who don't know, can you sort of explain it?
Um, Basically, the case of the Arab world's relationship with Germany, and I'm being reductionist here just to make a point, but the idea is that it's often the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And this is how they were viewed through the prism of the of the UK, Great Britain, and France's colonialism. And also, Germany was a very young country. Remember that they just showed up on the scene in the 1870s, uh, and they started building up relations with the rest of the world. So, if you are someone like the Kaiser Wilhelm II doing a tour of the Middle East in 1899, you don't have colonial baggage. It's difficult to hate someone like that, especially when he's juxtapositioning himself as the other, the different to Great Britain and France, and also spending on culture and museums and heritage preservation, and in one case praising Saladin, praising Salahuddin, and you know he was actually responsible for making Kaiser was responsible for making him a political symbol, where before that he was not seen as a political symbol within the Arab world. But the speech was very powerful, and it even made the Ottoman authorities take note of Saladin's appeal. Um, so it's and then during World War One, you had the Ottomans sided with Germany, so it gave it a sort of a holy flavor that Germany is not as cannot be as bad as France and the UK, and Germany's crimes in the at the turn of the 20th century were taking place in Namibia and southern Southwest Africa, so away from the Arab world. The other matter is that when we get to World War II, or we get to the 1930s, the Nazi regime starts manipulating the divisions in the Arab world and trying to, even to the point of censoring parts of or downplaying parts of Mein Kampf uh, for Arab audiences that was also anti-Arab in any case. The but it, and so these were all not ideological reasons; they were geostrategic reasons that were taking place. And when Rommel comes to North Africa uh, with his Africa Corps, he was more pragmatic than ideological. So we don't see the same sort of brutality in North Africa as we do in Europe. Uh, so all these matters, and then the final straw was the creation and the recognition of Israel, which Germany does, of course, and financially support. But also, there was this reluctant view that Germany was doing this out of guilt, but there were not. You don't see that same amount of anger that you might notice against Great Britain and the US and France in other situations.
Yeah, it's something that I've been trying to think about as well, but I think this honestly explains it. I've been also I kind of along those same lines. Another odd or not another relationship that we might say that today this is a present thing that Germany has with the Arab world is that we saw recently with all the critiques and criticism that we can muster about the Koblenz trial, and I'm not a lawyer, but I am aware that there are some disagreements, but we can put that aside for now. I'll try and do an episode on it specifically eventually, but at least symbolically. So for those who don't know, I'll just briefly describe it as it's been called the world's first criminal trial against members of the Assad regime for crimes against humanity, and it's taking place in Germany, as I said. I will link to a Der Spiegel article by Han al-Hitami and Christoph Reuter in the description. And I would also recommend there's a very good podcast called Branch 251, which is named after a notorious branch of the Syrian security apparatus. So people, it's in English, so people who are listening to this can check that out if they want. It kind of goes into it in detail. So, but symbolically, at the very least, now there is on paper, like now it's a legal fact that some version of accountability could be possible in Germany when it comes to the Arab world in ways that, as of now, is virtually impossible in the Arab world. Not just in Syria, obviously in Syria it's completely impossible, but in general throughout the Arab world it's unheard of, or at least it's very uncommon. What were sort of your reflections to, not maybe specifically the trial, but this notion that, I'm just curious because while rereading your essay some weeks ago in the Koblenz trial in the news again, I did get the sense that there was some kind of link between what you were saying about Berlin and what many Syrian exiles, for example, were celebrating. Celebrating this about the Koblenz trial and so on. So I was curious about your thoughts on that.
I mean, I have many thoughts about that. I think the I would say the Syrian activist Wafa Mustafa, who is a friend and a very powerful voice within the exotic community in Berlin, put it beautifully when she said about the first trial, when she said that uh, he is getting justice, which we sought for in Syria, and he's getting it now. The justice that he deprived others of. I'm paraphrasing. The justice that he was depriving citizens in Syria of, he's actually receiving it in his favor. Because if it was the other way around, where he was on the receiving end in Syria, he would not be getting injustice. It would be the end of him. And so uh, I think this really captures something really fundamental, because one of the questions that I really ponder upon is the amount of refugees, amount of Syrians who have left Syria, and all this for what? I mean, all this for Assad and his family to hold on to power. I mean, is that really worth it? We're talking about another type of evil here. We're talking about some prolonged evil that goes beyond banality and beyond the idea of radical evil. This obsession with power, this obsession with burning the whole country down, or not minding that the whole country burns down, just so you can keep the status quo going. So the trial, really symbolic in a way, is that it shows that the immunity that the despots and their supporters and their henchmen in the Arab world can get away with, it's no longer that easy anymore. I'm not saying they're all going to be arrested tomorrow. I don't know what's going to happen, but the precedent it sets is very powerful and startling, especially when they consider having to travel for work-related reasons or non-work related reasons.
Yeah, and also especially as I said, there's a legal aspect to this that can be debated elsewhere, but symbolically, it is also literally the first time in 11 years since the Arab Spring started in Syria and since March 2011 that we have seen any kind of I forgot who said this. Wafa is also a good friend. I had her on the podcast a couple of years ago, but I don't think she's the one who said this. Someone else said this. Like, it was almost like the fact that he was sitting there at court with other Syrians, exiles and refugees symbolically around him, especially outside of the court. It's almost like it took him down to their level, essentially. Like, now they were equals. That he was facing the same kind of justice, the same kind of accountability that in Syria is so impossible. It's almost cruel to talk about it. Like, it's so, any kind of accountability is dangerous in Syria for the Assad regime. The Assad regime sort of understood this a long time ago, clearly. And so, yeah, this is what I guess I would emphasize on that. And the fact that it is happening in Germany, I suppose would, and a few years after the big wave, as you mentioned, in 2015, I would imagine kind of reinforce this notion that there's something different about Germany that we've seen with the UK and France is simply not the same. It is how I would picture it anyway. I don't know if you would disagree with that.
No, I do agree with you. I don't think we would see this happen with the UK and France, and I don't know why I can't say specifically because of arms deals or because Germany does the same thing, etc. Uh, it could also just be that the Germany does see itself as the head of the EU, even if it doesn't necessarily have to hold a position as the president of the EU, but it sees itself as having that responsibility. Um, but I really cannot say, uh, you know, when are we going to see? I mean, are these uh, anomalies that have just happened, and are we going to see a pattern? I mean, I hope we see a pattern where war criminals are brought to justice, wherever that may be. And I don't think it would be happening in France and the United Kingdom, because we haven't really seen that much happen in that area. Besides, for example, Pinochet being arrested in the late 90s in the UK. But I mean, I could be enlightened more on the matter if there's other arrests that have happened in these areas.
No, that makes sense. That makes sense to me. Well, as it happens, we're recording this on January 26th, so this is one day after January 25, which in Egyptian history is obviously very significant since 2011, the start of the revolution there. I remember this very well. I was in Abu Dhabi for some random reason, and there were Egyptians on the streets with flags and everything, and I think this was the most political moment I've seen in Abu Dhabi ever since. Given that this episode will be out a few weeks later, but we are recording this around the same time as to January 25th. The crackdowns and repressions that followed throughout the Arab world led many of us to find refuge elsewhere. I myself am in many ways luckier than other nationalities because I'm from Lebanon, and the crackdowns haven't intensified in the same way. I talk about the specificity of the threats that I face in another episode with Denamas, which is already out, and obviously people can listen to that one. But you have this description of Berlin, which, if it's okay, I'm going to quote back at you. So you describe it as, Berlin is where the newly arrived Arab suddenly, but not always, recognizes that the frightful habit of glancing over the shoulder, painfully inherited from back home, gradually recedes. All the while, a new dawn slowly sets in among the meetings of peers in this new city. As such, Berlin is not just a city, it is a political laboratory that enforces a new type of beginning, one that turns heads in the direction of matters greater than the individual. And it generates a realization that the grey blur that nauseatingly blankets the future can actually be broken up, end quote. If I were to compare this description to where I currently live, for example, Geneva, there's one thing in common and one thing that's definitely a difference. So the thing in common is that I've also felt in the past couple of years this habit of being, you describe it as a frightful habit of glancing over the shoulder. For me, the way I would picture it is being hyper alert all the time. Like I still am, it's not completely gone, but I used to be significantly on hyper alert mode at all times. I would be very up to date with what's happening back in Lebanon, as well as to a lesser extent elsewhere in the region. But at the same time, I would also be very aware of what's happening in the UK, in France, in Germany, like as much as is humanly possible, obviously, with this instinctual feeling, you might say, or knowledge, or that I needed to know as much as possible because that was the best protection. This was a way of protecting myself. I had to be hyper aware and hyper knowledgeable, which has its pros and cons. But so this is something that I have been seeing the past couple of years in Geneva, that despite the pandemic, as it happens, we moved specifically to this address the very week, actually the day of the explosion in Beirut. So in 2020, August 2020. So very much like Geneva has been this city that's often described as boring by a lot of people, but I realized that it's what I needed. I needed a city that was boring, where quote unquote nothing was happening. I needed to know that I could walk anywhere. I could leave my phone at home and it didn't really matter. There was no security issues in that sense, and just be there in that sense. So this is something that I would see in comparison. Like I can compare it to what you said about Berlin. The difference, though, is the second bit, which is, where is it? So all the while, a new dawn slowly sets in among the meeting of peers in this new city. This is something that in Geneva is not as common. I have met people, who are Arabs and even non-Arabs who are exiles or refugees or migrants and so on. But because there is this transience that I mentioned before, like, in advance that everyone that you're meeting, for the most part, most people that you're meeting, aren't here for any kind of long-term period. Either they're here for a job or they got some kind of scholarship temporarily, that sort of thing. But it's not permanent. They're going to leave very soon. I've also seen the same thing in London, because I lived in London for 2 years and then Edinburgh for 2 years. It was also the same thing. I could meet a lot of people. I saw a lot of diversity, especially London more than Edinburgh as well, of course, but still. And there were these long established communities, so I could see that there was a potential of meeting, as you say, peers, a meeting of peers in this city, which for me was new at the time. But for political reasons, visa-related reasons, and so on, I knew that those second generation, third generation Arab, British Arabs, etc., and so on, were there from a previous wave. Like this wasn't the same wave as mine. I didn't even know it was a wave back then, but what ended up becoming a wave. Because of at the time it was easier to have an academic visa, for example, and to stay in the UK long term. That's why there are so many academics of different backgrounds who are in their 50s and 60s, 40s, 50s, 60s and above in the UK compared to 30s and 20s, which is becoming more and more difficult, and obviously younger even more so. So it's more just of a comment rather than a specific question, because my next or more of an open question, kind of a discussion, because there's also this very good quote that I know you've shared on Twitter a number of times, and I know this of Naguib Mahfouz, who said, like, home is not where you were born, home is where all your attempts to escape cease, right? And so I can see a bit of this in Geneva, but there's something missing that, from what I can read in your description of Berlin, is to be found in Berlin. Can you talk a bit about this notion of home being this place where all attempts to escape cease, and how, whether this is what you found in Berlin?
Okay, I will say that. First of all, Nakim Mahfouz didn't actually make the quote. It's just attributed to him, and I've
Oh,
actually made
okay.
the correction. But it is a beautiful quote nonetheless. I definitely have not found it in Berlin. I'll say that, but I don't know where I found it. It's not in Alexandria, Egypt, or part of it is here. It's not in Perth, Western Australia, where I grew up. And Berlin does satisfy some homely criterias, maybe in an intellectual sense, uh, but not fully. And I think it's really the question of coming to terms what it means to live in the modern world under the new liberal storm, where community is becoming fragmented, and how do we piece this matter back together. Um, when I say community, I say it with a capital C. I cannot emphasize the need for this matter. And yes, Berlin itself has a transit community. Many people will also recognize that it does feel transient, even if you're on a 5-year scholarship, or if there's still something transient about it. The the idea of community is something that is so primary that I don't even believe we should even be using uh, the internet to facilitate this. I mean, sure, to support it, that's a different matter. But my thinking has gone back to the bricks and mortar way of building spaces, because in 2011, remember those days of the Facebook revolution and the Twitter, and how these social media tools were celebrated. Sure, yes, the Western media exaggerated a bit, but there was an actual perception in the Arab world that these tools are important, and they helped overthrow regimes and all that. And this was a popular view. It wasn't an imposed view. But also, what happens is that when you become overly reliant on this, even before the pandemic just worsened it. But the you do start to fragment from each other, and I think there needs to be a re-examination of social spaces, whether they be the cafes or the coffee houses or the mosques or the churches, the campuses, whatever they may be, and really find its potential to make the effort to go to such a place to meet up and form a community. It doesn't automatically happen like that, but the idea is that there are many, uh, you can say, lonely hearts in every household, and people are looking for some sort of uh, solidarity and love. And I mean this. I say these terms in the wider sense of the word. And I don't believe coping mechanisms can only. I mean, sure, you can find them amongst as an individual, but only to a point. And then you need to branch out and find the we. Uh, And it doesn't have to be necessarily a political project, but it needs some sort of engagement, some sort of participation where you know your worth by measuring it against the audience that you speak to. And we have many such exiles like that across Europe. Uh, and 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 sure, you can feel like Mahmoud Darwish, the Palestinian poet, said you can feel like you can be an exile in your bedroom. It doesn't, in your own homeland. That's very common. And the bigger question is, how do we bring our ideas as intellectuals, as academics, as writers, in an interventionist sense, to break the isolation and the alienation and the rootlessness that has taken over? We live a very different life to what our grandparents lived. Certainly our parents, but definitely our grandparents. This whole the way marriage used to work, the way child rearing, staying in the same, you know, town, all that has been fragmented. No one has a job for life anymore. No one has a this idea of uh, a predictable workflow, and also in terms of um, in terms of political thinking, it's changed a lot in the sense of there is no more long-term visions. If we look at the Nahda, the Renaissance movement in the Arab world in the late 19th century, uh, they could write 50 years into the future. They were very prophetic in that sense. Doesn't mean they got it right, but they could write their novels and their prose and their programs in a way that looked 50 years ahead. Today, we are lucky if we can do that 5 years ahead. We'll be very lucky if we could just reach 5 years. It's difficult to do 5 years, pandemic notwithstanding.
Yeah, and part of my what a lot of things that I do get into this podcast is this need for futurism, this need for actually by the time this episode comes out, there's going to be an episode with Nat Muller, which would be out, who's this curator who curates Palestinian art and other kinds of art, and what her thesis, we talked about her thesis because it was very much on retrofuturism, as she calls it, like this tendency in many Arab works of art specifically to try and re-examine the past in the hope of having a different kind of future. So there is this kinds of things happening, but very much so, and I see this in works such as like Palestine plus 100, which is set 100 years after the Nakba, after 48, or Iraq plus 100, which is set 100 years after 2003, and so on and so forth. Even in those books, with all of the which are really worth reading and they're very important, I did get the sense that this is a very difficult thing to do, and so the best stories have been very fictional. Like they were set 100 years later, but they were just fictional stories rather than an attempt to picture what that year might look like, or what that decade might look like. But you mentioned this the Naguib Mahfouz, not Naguib Mahfouz quote, the notion of this home is where all your attempts to escape cease. It reminds me, like in your essay, there is a Syrian director Nidal Hassan who was told by another Syrian artist in, I think it was in Berlin, what this thing happened, like what can artists do in exile? Like basically the question is like, well, we're in exile, what can we do from here? Obviously, it's like you said before, this notion that one has to be in the centers in order to affect a real change. And Hassan had this, I'm quoting what you said, like Hassan is, paraphrasing, had this very good response, which is that Syrians were in exile even before leaving Syria, that Syrians were in exile in Syria. Not that dissimilar from what Mahmoud Darwish said about Palestinians in what's today Israel Palestine, being in exile in one's own homeland. This is something I've definitely concluded as well. This profound sense of alienation, it used to be, because so in summer 2015 I left Lebanon for the first time, for at least for any kind of long period of time, to do my master's in London. And it used to be that whenever I would feel homesick or whatever I would feel this kind of ache, you might say, well, it would be resolved by simply going home. And of course, there's the privilege of me being able to do so. So I would simply go back every Like I would go back, I think 4 or 5 times a year at one point. So every like 3 months or so. So there wasn't any very long period of time. In fact, now as we're talking, this is the longest I've ever been outside of Lebanon. It's going to be 2 years. And but that kind of what I was saying is that this waves, you might say, this backs and forth from the UK to Lebanon, the UK to Lebanon, Lebanon to UK, back and forth and so on. And then coming here, early 2020, that process, which is a 5 year process more or less between 2015 and 2020, whenever I would go back, there would be something, I don't know how to describe it, like an extra heaviness. There's something that I would get used, and I describe it, I have a very, very visual mind. So I would describe it as, I was speaking to Hamid Sidno, I think he's the lead singer of Mashra Layla, for those who don't know, a Lebanese band. I was saying how almost obsessed I was when I was in London about benches, just like public benches. And I fell really in love with there's a thing in the UK which I actually quite like of like cemeteries being also parks at the same time. So there was one in between dorms in London, the SOAS dorms, which are next to King's Cross. I would walk to campus, which was like a 20-25 minutes walk, and I would go through this cemetery, which anyone listening who've been there know which one I'm talking about. There's only one. And I would feel very at peace over there. I would feel very much like this is something that in Lebanon we don't have really. We have a few, but they're not very good and they're not very accessible parks. The notion of a bench in a city like Beirut, like we would joke about them. Like we would see a bench and actually joke about it because there would be like 5 of them, and they would be sponsored by one of the banks, for example, because it's the only way that a bench can get any funding. And that's what AUB, the American University of Beirut, was for me. AUB, I did 3 years there, my undergrad 2010 to 2013. That was my public space, even though obviously it wasn't public. Just the benches, just the idea of sitting, that you're allowed to sit, which as a student you're allowed to do, and that's it. That no further expectation. You can be with yourself. You can read a book. You can do nothing. You can sleep on it. Nothing matters. Like as in, there's no obligation to having to deal with traffic or having to pay, because the only way you can do so in Beirut is be in a cafe. There isn't any kind of obligation to do so. And so it would be these little things that, well, they seem like little, but they're actually pretty fundamental, that actually people who live in Geneva, who grew up here, very much take for granted. A good bus system, a good tram system, a good train system, all of those things which in Lebanon we don't really have. At least not very good, and we don't have trains or trams. So all of this to say that you have this other, you quote this other person, Dina Wahba, if I got the name right, describing a sort of survivor's guilt, right? And even I would say like it intersects with this impostor syndrome as well at times. And I've had Asa Khattab, who, again, the episode will be out by the time this is out. So he's the Syrian journalist who's been in Paris for a couple, actually we left Beirut the same month, so a couple of years. Before that, he was in Beirut, and obviously before that, he was in Syria. And he himself describes having this survivor's guilt, having this imposter syndrome. Like, are my views still representative? Or can I still speak for Lebanon? I'm putting these in quotation. Can I still even write about Lebanon, for example? Those are questions that I obviously still go through and I still wrestle and struggle with. So I'm very curious if you can talk a bit either of your own personal experience or, people that you've talked to maybe in Berlin or elsewhere who have had to kind of deal with these questions.
You really raised up a lot of fascinating points, I have to say, Joey. And it's actually interesting that you bring up the bench, because I literally have the same problem with the idea of benches. And to give you an example, actually, it takes place in Alexandria at the mall, where there was an old woman at the information desk of the mall. So this mall, by the way, it's like a long stretch where there are stores alongside, and you can't, so it's not like a round, so it's like a long stretch. And I overheard the conversation where the woman was asking, where did the benches go within the mall? She wants to sit down, she wants to take a rest. And I asked, I intervened, and I asked the worker, I asked, where are they actually? She needs to sit down. He goes, well, they've been removed, but why? And then he says to her, well, you could sit in a cafe. And she goes, but I don't want to sit in a cafe. And it really made sense. Then he said to her, well, if you want to sit for free, then there's a food court, but the food court is at the end of the mall. She wants to take respite. And then he uses the example of teenagers who abuse it and sit, etc. But I'm like, that's why you have security, and you can tell them to go like you always do. I don't understand, why are there no benches? Interestingly enough, he couldn't give me an answer, but I I actually met the head of the mall at a party, and there were and he told me, and he said to me, the sheikh of what some Gulf country doesn't it was his idea or something, and I'm like, I'm not surprised. This came from this certain Gulf country, and but for me it was telling because often the the bigger changes start with the smaller changes. And if you remove a park bench, if you remove a bench in a mall, which is not really a public space, but it is in a way a public space in the modern sense, then what next? Because the what we are suffering in the Arab world is a form of mutant capitalism that does not understand any sort of humane choreography. It's building and expansion for the sake of expansion, and there is no conclusion to this mutant capitalism. When there is no conclusion, there is no rahmah, there is no mercy. That's what frightens me. And when you remove benches, it really says a lot about your worldview as a person on this planet. Regarding your next point about
Before you get into that, there's the example I can think of is in Beirut. Two examples. One is Martyrs Square, which is supposed to be the main square in Beirut, is quite literally a parking spot. And it used to be up until some years ago a parking spot for downtown, as we would call it, and it's actually pretty common to hear it mentioned in English, like downtown, rather than as it would be called al balad, or referring to it as Solidaire, which is the private company which basically owns a lot of it. We would literally say, like, we're going to the cinema to Solidaire. Like, we would call the place where we're going, the physical location of where we're going, either downtown or Solidaire. I would still hear, especially with the previous generation, al balad, but then there was I reflected on this a few years ago, like this very interesting, if not distressing, disconnect between what they were talking about, because a lot of it was from memory, like something that they remember, especially before the 70s and the 80s, before the Civil War, and what we know of. Like, I never knew I was born in 1991, like the year when the war kind of ended or was finishing, and I never knew a Beirut that did not have this kind of intense privatization, right? Like this kind of space that's not really a space, where the only real space we would hang out are the malls, essentially, and because they're malls, you wouldn't really be able to really sit down for any long period of time. But anyway, yeah, please continue.
No, you're right. I think the dirtiest word in the Arabic language is tatawur, development. I used to think it was a beautiful word once upon a time, and then I realized nothing generally comes good from this word that masquerades as progress, as better, as good. But we really see anything but any of that. In fact, it's quite telling when we lose more heritage buildings to developers than we do to war. That's and especially Lebanon. Like, it really is quite significant when we consider that. Regarding survivor's guilt, it really varies from person to person. Some people have a better handle of it. Some people cannot. Some people, feel no guilt. It really varies. It's difficult to say. At least what I see in the research in Berlin is that it's not necessarily a collective sort of force of survivor's guilt, because part of the reason why I say that is that many people are immersed in the current present. This and the problems that comes with being in German society and Berlin cosmopolitanism and fending off racism. And so one of one of my research assistant, Salma, when she was looking into this in Berlin, she noted also the fact that there was an exhaustion among Syrians with the and the fetishness of the victim narrative, which they're trying to escape. But also, the German system is structured in a way where you only get funding if you play the role of the victim. And so it robs the Arab exile, and particularly the Syrians, because they're center stage, of their agency and what they're able to produce. The other the other challenges that they face in Berlin is the increased Arab embassy activity and intelligence gathering, which you can easily see at lectures, where they can become quite disruptive if there's a rowdy diplomat that's there. And also, they're struggling with integration. They're It's not a case where they're trying to integrate, but they look at the previous Arab diasporas in Germany, where they have tried to integrate, but they're not well accepted. So they're caught in this no man's land in between two cultures. And so many in Berlin just give up on the idea of integrating, saying that we're not going to be accepted. The racism is too much anyway. So let's just live in our bubbles, which ironically also gives them a sort of strength where it allows them to focus on their projects and their rather than having to always impress, the wider society.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, kind of a deeper dive on the some of the challenges that you mentioned. I had Musa Okwonga on. That's episode 64 for those listening. Well, I had him on a number of times, but the last time we spoke about this book that he wrote on well, largely on Berlin. It's called In the End It Was All About Love. And he's English, and he's a black Englishman, and the only relevance, the reason I'm bringing that up is that obviously he brought up the racism that he feels in Berlin, and that there something that I sort of knew but I didn't really know in detail, that there are literally certain parts of the city that he simply cannot go, especially after dark. So I was wondering if you can just talk a bit more about some of the difficulties that you think, let's say especially the new wave of exilee, refugees, migrants, and so on since 2015 or thereabout. What are certain things that they're facing, and are there any indications that it's getting better or worse or like the same?
Sure. Is the situation getting better or worse? I think the pandemic has put a sort of a freeze, a sort of hold on being able to effectively measure life in Berlin. It feels like a very unusually long transit, whatever is happening in this pandemic era. But I can say generally that some of them are facing the challenges that I mentioned, where I won't say some of them, but the idea of trying to be accepted beyond the refugee status. This is just what they have become iconic for, and they have to structure their funding and their approach through this victim narrative that German institutions favor. So it really limits the idea of creativity. But then you have a generational divide where the older generation will follow the German law to the letter on this matter, where the young exiles will say, we will write the application to favor, a funding, and we'll do whatever we want after that. So there's a different mindset in this regard. The other matter is that in the post 2011 Arab Berlin, the the exiles have described the pre 2011 Arab diaspora as apolitical, and so this is quite significant because it also means that there's a divide between those who came after 2011 and before 2011. And also there's a resentment from the diaspora, from the pre 2011 Arab diaspora towards the newcomers, because they did not have to experience the relative difficulty of growing up as a person of color in the German system. This is a very widespread resentment. The other factor is that the young generation who came before 2011 speak better German than Arabic. So that's another sort of divide or barrier that creeps up. The other factor also is that the post 2011 exiles rarely considered Berlin as a destination before 2011. It just never showed up on the radar. Of a place that you will go to. It was always either London, New York, or the US in general. But one of the strategic moves on behalf of the German system that they did well was to allow English as a way of mobility within Berlin. You couldn't do this in Paris. I can't imagine the French authorities allowing English as a as a way to you. I mean, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but as a way to move and as a way of social mobility relative to Berlin. I mean,
Yeah, no, there's been some changes on that in like past few years from what I know. But yeah, generally speaking, it's just it's not realistic if you do not know French that to think that you would be able to stay in Paris long enough. I think that's a fair assessment.
yeah, and I would also just add one more point is that uh, there's something really fundamental happening as well in the context of Berlin, but I would say in Europe. Many are meeting other Arabs for the first time in Europe. It's not happening in the Arab world. So for the first time, I met other Arab Spring thinkers and activists. It took place in Copenhagen in September 2011 for me. This was phenomenal. It didn't happen in Cairo or it didn't happen in Alexandria or Tunis. It's happening in European cities. Berlin just being more concentrated and well exposed. So I think
No,
that says a lot. Hmm?
yeah, no, this is the same that happened to me in 2015 in London. I had met some Syrians and Palestinians, for example, at the UB, but not that many. It wasn't on that scale. And certainly not like Egyptians, Libyans, Yemenis, other nationalities. It's in London, and crucially because of Lebanon specific politics, the Syrians and Palestinians that I met in London were my legal equal. Because in Lebanon, obviously, you have all of those hierarchies of citizenship and non-citizen and refugees and migrants and whatnot.
Exactly. Yeah.
Uh,
Kafala.
so Kafala, exactly. So there was this very, very distinct. There was a difference. There was really a difference that even in Lebanon, despite my best intentions, there would be this power dynamic that definitely limits, especially from the perspective of an activist, with some exceptions. But generally speaking, this would be the case. And sort of speaking of this, this potential relationship, we might say, between Berlin, some of those cities, some of those capitals, especially. Well, you wrote this in 2019, so you were talking that you were mentioning how this Arab Berlin, as you call it, would need to build a reciprocal relationship with Arab cities beyond the institutional level. So you mentioned how there is this institutional level, which we know of. Currently, and you mentioned the two candidates most receptive to new ideas are Tunis and Beirut. Now, obviously, since then, Beirut's been facing a lot of difficulties, so maybe one day it could be again. But what did you mean by, at least theoretically, like the need to have I guess I could describe it as more of an organic connection between a city like Berlin and a city like Tunis, for example, a city like Beirut, or other examples as well.
I could definitely see uh, schools of thoughts emerging in Berlin, or ideational movements, or some sort of philosophy, and being shifted to Beirut or Tunis. Maybe Tunis is a bit of a difficulty at the moment, but certainly Beirut, because true Beirut is a powder keg, and but it doesn't. It still has a lot of gaps of freedom and mobility that we don't see in most Arab cities of North Africa and the Middle East. So the question is, if successful uh, intellectual ventures were to happen in Berlin, uh, and if we were to follow historical patterns of how they return back to the homeland or the region, and could they have some sort of force? I could see this happening in Beirut. If you asked me many years ago, I would have said Cairo straight away. But it's not really in a position that it can. And I think if it was Cairo, it would be able to have much more of a heavyweight in the output and production and movement of ideas. That this is not happening anytime soon. Having said that, historically, if we look at where ideas come from, if we use Pan-Arabism for all its faults, this is a very Levantine, Syrian, Lebanese phenomenon that uh, that was birthed and crafted in Beirut and Damascus, and only came to Egypt all the way, like in a very heavy political sense, in the 1950s. after Gamal Abdel Nasser took over. But it was always brewing in that part of the world, in the Levant, compared to other parts of the region. It took its force because of the size of Egypt and its cultural production, that it could actually give it an impetus. But its authority and legitimacy comes from Shem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this makes me think there was an article that came out, I remember around, I was at the UB, so that would have been 2012, 2013, sort of by I don't remember who it was, but by a Khaliji, like by a Gulf, I think Saudi person, like a journalist, a writer, and actually saying that the new capitals of culture is basically becoming Dubai and Riyadh and so on. And the argument that was being made is very straightforward. You know, things are bad elsewhere post 2011, especially around 2013 or so. The money is in the Gulf. We know this. A lot of people go there for job opportunities and so on. And that was kind of the end of the argument. Then obviously the critique of that, which I had back then and I would still have today, is that yes, there is a certain stability that can come, and I'm not downplaying that a from financial security, from a decent salary, from that sort of thing. But crucially, as you yourself mentioned, there are all of these conditions and limitations that come from living in the Gulf. For one, you just simply cannot say much that's inherently political unless it is already aligned with what the government is saying, for example, what the governments are saying. And even then, there are limitations. You can't go too far on that. And so, for me, that's kind of the crucial bit. I'm from Lebanon, so I will sound biased, but there is, and there still is to a certain extent, a possibility of talking about, like, for example, the whole insulting the president, which is illegal in Lebanon, legal, like it's against the law. People do it all the time anyway, and some people do get some heat. Some people do get arrested. For the most part, they then get released. Like it's a way of pressuring them essentially, but it's still very common to at least be open about these things. Now there are some limitations, when it comes to Hezbollah. There's more like certain things that you cannot really do or say and so on. And so there are some limitations, and not just them, but them especially, I would say. But yeah, that being said, there was this. There's always this funny thing that I heard a different iteration of that saying many times. Like I forgot what it was, but like Egypt writes, Lebanon publishes, and Baghdad reads, or something, or Beirut, Cairo writes, something like that. And I've heard different iterations of this, which was actually funny. Which was, one of them was Sudan, Khartoum writes, Beirut publishes, and Baghdad reads. Which, like, I feel like basically everyone wants to be the one that writes, and so it's just kind of funny. But sort of on the kind of a final thing before we get into the book section, if that's okay.
Yeah.
One thing that I have a particular interest in, which is languages and the politics of languages. That was my master's. My master's was on the politics of Yiddish and Hebrew specifically. And the episode before this one, actually, literally the episode before this one, I touched a bit about that. We are having this conversation in English. Of course, we can have it in Arabic. But it is common to have these conversations in English. I would imagine that in different contexts, in different settings, we might hear kind of similar conversations in German or in French, especially, maybe in Turkish as well these days. And I would suspect to a lesser extent, but also to some extent in Spanish and other languages. What do you think is sort of, and I say this because I've asked this question a number of times. I've had, for example, Salim Haddad on, who is a Lebanese, Lebanese, Palestinian, etc., Iraqi as well, author, who wrote this beautiful novel called Guapa, and he wrote it in English. And I remember I asked him that question because he went on BBC Arabic, and so of course they spoke in Arabic. And she asked him, like the host asked him, like, why did you write it in Arabic? Don't you feel that something was lost? And his response was, yes, of course, something is lost, but well, he's simply more comfortable in English. And I would say that as far as the written word is concerned, when I speak, I'm okay with both. But when it comes to writing, because my higher education, I should say, has been in in English, like AUB, then University of London, and now, Edinburgh, and then now Zurich is also in English. I'm doing it. It's how I'm able to form my ideas. I'm able to express myself in a certain way, better than French, actually. And French is one of my two native languages, because this is my higher the language of my higher education. So, what are your sort of thoughts on this in terms of, can one be, for example, let me put it that way, can one be an Arab exile? Can we build an Arab exile body without Arabic, or does it only have to be through Arabic?
I'm also going to be biased, and I'll have to say this is a very important question, and I don't think a
Yeah.
day ever passes without me thinking about it. I'm also comfortable in English, but also it's because of my third culture kid upbringing, particularly in Australia. I love the Arabic language, and I wish I would use it, in such situations, which I do, by the way. But I think we take use, or we latch onto the English language for a few reasons, and we cannot delude ourselves as well. First of all, it is more safer to speak in English than Arabic. Most people who have disappeared have often used Arabic as a form of communication. Maybe this is conscious or unconscious, but it's a reality. How many times when we've written articles, and when an Arabic publisher asked us to translate it to Arabic, and I've had to refuse. Uh,
I've done the same as well, yeah.
Although the audience that would benefit the most would be an Arabic speaking audience, but the price is too high to pay. The other factor is that it is, at this point in history, a universal language that we have to work with, because the the delivery and the output would be limited with any other languages, even if it was French. The other factor also, I would say, is that it's like a black Tunisian on Twitter. What she said was quite powerful when she said that when someone criticized her for using English to discuss racism, and to discuss racism in Tunisia, and uh, and everything related to that. She says that English has just become more developed in this area of anti-racist discourse because of the civil rights movement, and matters, and um, critical theory and anti-colonialism. There's just much more developed in that area, where you can use it, where Arabic hasn't had that luxury, because often, uh, not only has it not had the luxury to develop an anti-racist discourse, there's just a default position that you find in the Arabic-speaking world, where they'll say there's no racism. So that's just like, or they'll mention Bilal or something, like this. There's just this strange form of inability to engage with something so serious, but it's often you know, denied and said, لا ده بيحصل في الغرب. This happens in the West, and so we're not able to even get to stage one of this discussion. Although things are improving over the years, I have to say, but still there's a long way to go in this region. Uh, the other point I'll mention, I think it was by the Libyan British author Hasham Matar, where he says that English is how I communicate. It's like he owns it. It's his language, and he can deliver his points powerfully. So I think the ideology of languages can be problematic, and it can be manipulative as well, especially when uh, it's used to silence those. Like, for me, the biggest criticisms against my use of English on Twitter comes from regime bots in the region. It doesn't necessarily come from someone else who is in a position of Arabic authority, etc. Uh, and finally, I'm actually facing this dilemma, because I'm moving to Morocco, in a few months, and I've been advised to learn French, and I find this really crazy. I would never tell someone coming to Egypt to learn English. but but for some reason, French has really entered the Darija lexicon in such a way that it's difficult to separate it from there. Uh, and Moroccans are divided about this, and it's something I'm going to have to discover when I move there.
Yeah, I always tell this to people like when this is asked that the vast majority of people in Lebanon, which again is sort of a best case scenario as of now in terms of repression, when they were arrested because usually out of two reasons. One, they said something direct, so they mentioned a president by name or like that sort of. Even Lebanon has this. I don't know if it's a law, but it's definitely a practice where you're not allowed to actually insult other heads of states as well.
Mm.
Um, Now, obviously, the way it's applied is very different. Like if you insult the Israeli prime minister, the Lebanese don't care. But if you insult the Saudi king, which happened a number of times, that's when you can get in trouble. And then the second thing is that it will be done in Arabic. It will be like a video on Instagram of someone directly insulting the president. It will be a tweet directly mentioning Nasrallah or the president, whatever. It will be something always on those lines where if you're just writing something, you have the in English especially, you do have a sort of distance. And I think we do underestimate, and I appreciate that you mentioned this because I've myself, I've definitely wrestled with that question. I would say now I'm a bit more at ease with it than I was a few years ago because I was in Beirut and I was writing in English. I did sometimes write in Arabic, and French as well, but for the most part I wrote in English for various reasons. Kind of the jobs I was getting required me to write in English, or that sort of thing. But it also became those two things that you mentioned. One, it was safer, either whether this is rational or not. I don't think it matters. It was like you kind of learn this by doing it. You see what works and what doesn't work. You see that something gets a violent reaction and something doesn't in the same way. As you said, even in terms of online activity, even when it comes to Twitter, um, for the most part, I don't get the same kind of bots and attacks when I write in English as I do when I used to tweet in Arabic, which I haven't done in a while now. So it's something that I'm still wrestling with, and I wish there was an ideal situation where everything I say can have an Arabic translation without the repercussions, or if I can just do so in Arabic as well, I wouldn't have those other limitations of, well, my audience is just a fraction of it because I don't have the institutional resources or support or whatnot, or those other stuff that we've mentioned. So it's something that I would just say, kind of like as a concluding thing, that it is something that is very much of an open question, and I appreciate people who treat it as an open question rather than this is how things should be, and if you don't speak only in Arabic all the time, you're no longer a good Arab, or whatever. I feel like that's a very reductive way of thinking of things, as if the Arabs during the Ottoman Empire who would communicate in Turkish with other people as if they were no longer Arab, for example. There's a very reductive way of looking at this, unfortunately, and it's still there. So we'll leave it at that on that sense.
Yeah.
Unless you have anything else you wanted to add before I sort of we get into the book section, we'll just get into the book section directly. Up to you.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say the points you raised are brilliant, and I think the politics of language will be something that will be with us every day. And I think it's not like out of spite that we speak English, or it's just the situation has in a way forced us into these spaces and into these positions to speak that. And it's not just us. I mean, even Germans have to realize eventually that they have to speak English when they want to engage with the world. That it becomes actually a drawback to stick to only German. So it's not just an Arab world phenomenon, for example. In
Yeah.
fact, yeah.
No, no, sorry. Continue.
And in Morocco, there was an article I think that came out in the New York Times, or was it the Atlantic, where they had, people are learning English as a form of resistance against the French because they found the French language is imperialistic, etc. And so English is like an escape out of that. It's strange that they have to go for a European language, but I get the idea, how they're trying to make that shift and so forth. But also career-wise and social mobility, it makes sense to latch onto the English language. But I think it's an important topic. But I feel that there's a time for speaking Arabic. Like for me, it's when I give public lectures in Egypt. I will I'll use Arabic for some lectures and English for other lectures. And there's an advantage of using Arabic here is that I'm much more careful. There's more, it's difficult to sort of censor me, or I'm more hyper aware. And if someone had any doubts, they can ask me a question and I can answer it in front of a live audience. When you write in Arabic, it's published. That's it. It could be open to any interpretation. Whereas when you have a human face to a human face, it's more manageable. It's more um, uh, relatively a bit more safer uh, compared to the writing aspect. And once again, we have to deal with the mess that colonialism has left us, and the whole baggage that comes with it. You know, the in this region with identity and religions and regions and country and citizenship and flags and football teams and mobility and cosmopolitanism. Like there is a lot to consume, and we pick our language depending on the time of day in the audience.
Yeah, I'm reminded of a I forgot who it was, but I believe it, an African American writer. She said something along the lines of like English is the language of our oppressors, but I needed to communicate with you. It's something very something along those lines. I'm paraphrasing, and this is something not a lot of people know. But even in Lebanon, because of obviously the French legacy, um, I have seen this. Like when I went to AUB, which again is the American University of Beirut, for those who don't know, there was a sense that because I was a Frenchie, quote unquote, as they used to call it, and I cannot roll my R's, which is a stereotypically French thing. I was perceived as somehow more middle class or more even upper class than some other people who were speaking in English, and so there was this very kind of funny but also odd situation where English became the language of the people, and within the very bubble context that is the American University of Beirut. And so there is just that. I would see like student protests against tuition hikes, against very local issues like in Beirut, Save Beirut Heritage, or others, ending the kafala system. And of course, you will have a lot of Arabic, but it wouldn't be uncommon to also see signs in English or even chants. Well, chants not as much. There is this very interesting thing of like, well, the writing can be in English, but when we speak, it's in Arabic. And there's this very interesting dynamic that happens, which I would hopefully like to explore more one day. But in any case, that that being said, what are sort of to kind of wrap up? What are sort of three books that you would recommend to our listeners, and why those three?
Okay, so starting off, I would recommend City of Exiles, Berlin from the Outside In, by the Australian author Stuart Braun. So actually, when I saw his book in a cafe, it was displayed in a cafe, that sort of enabled me to link it to the idea of the Arab exiles. So he gives more of a historical brushstroke of history of Berlin, of the exiles that have included everyone from the Russians to Spaniards, different types of exiles and why they make it exiles, why Berlin is receptive to exiles relative compared to other cities. So he explored it nicely, and he gave it, and it's a very easy read, I would say, as well. And I'm actually grateful for that book. It's actually very, I think, it stands the test of time with what is happening in Berlin and how we can treat Berlin as a social and political laboratory to create new beginnings and new civic initiatives. The next one I would say is The Representations of the Intellectual by Edward Said. This one's a very nice one, and I've always really wanted to know what is the role of intellectuals in, well, he used obviously the 20th century, but where we fit in in these patterns of the different types of intellectuals and their responsibility to the public welfare. So it's a very excellent book that he gave in based on a series of lectures that he gave in 1993. And finally, the third book I would say is Exile, Statelessness, and Migration: Playing Chess with History, from Hannah Arendt to Isaiah Berlin. So this one is written by Seila Bahabib. Not sure if you've come across it, but it fascinates me the fact that their Jewish identity informed all their experiences of being outsiders, as well as thinkers that ended up producing brilliant and moving intellectual movements of modernity. And I think there is some overlap with emerging Arab intellectual currents. And the question one could ask is, how can we learn from them? It's actually quite funny because uh, there was a Jewish intellectual in Berlin who approached me 2 years ago after reading the essay and told me how the essay basically inspired his work with Jewish leftist activism in Berlin. And I told him, "You don't need to thank me. I stole most of my ideas from Jews anyway. I just repackaged it and gave it back to you."
This is perfect because, as I said, the episode just before this one, with Cindy Milstein, we spoke about Jewish radicalism and Jewish diasporism, especially. And my intention from that was to actually have and it's going to be in the title of that episode, like in Arab or a Jewish Arab diaspora conversation, essentially. So that was a very, very wholesome conversation where she was referencing obviously the very, very long history of exile and displacement and all and most of the time forced that many Jews have faced throughout history, and how this actually informs her need for community, her need for always believing that there is an alternative, always the need to build something different, and so on. So it's very nice that this is sort of how we wrap it out on, because it's accidentally, I didn't actually plan the timeline on purpose, complements in some sense that conversation.
Very nice.
So, well, on that note, Amro, thanks a lot for your time. I really, really enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you, Joy. I really enjoyed it. I loved it. And it actually made me think a lot of the topics that were raised that I'll be taking into consideration over the next couple of days and weeks. So I thank you for the
Amazing.
conversation. I benefited from it as well.